do I define death? Well, I suppose coming from a medical background, I've got very, death is obviously when there's no life left in someone, they're not breathing and whatnot, because from a nursing background, that is the clinical kind of view of death. But I suppose on a more realistic personal level, death is just that loss, that feeling that that person's not going to be there anymore. It's that void that's left, that void, I suppose, that you're not going to see them, you're not going to be with them. So it's the emptiness it leaves.
Good words. I love that word, void. That's cropped up before. I like that. So if you're happy, so only share what you're happy sharing. Could you just tell me about any encounter or encounters with death? How has death impacted your story?
Being brought up in Northern Ireland, I've had a very different exposure to death than people in England traditionally would have. So I've had death kind of surrounding me from a very early age. And I was also brought up during the Troubles, so you were aware of people being murdered and killed who you knew quite regularly. So death was just constantly around you, and also being brought up in a big extended family with grandparents and an elderly uncle living with us at home. I was brought up with them dying at home and going through kind of the traditional things people do in Ireland when somebody dies. So death's been something that has kind of been very much in just in my upbringing from the earliest. I could sort of go back to a really early age when death was something that I was aware of. Plus in my culture that was brought up, when death is openly talked about, it is a big thing. There's a very cultured routine about how you deal with death, and it is very openly talked about, and going to funerals is a really, really important thing in that culture. So to give you an example, in Ireland, you would traditionally get buried 2 days after you die. So if I died today, Monday, I would be buried on Wednesday, unless you had to have postmortems and things. So it's a very structured routine and a very traditional routine that everybody's aware of. You would also have the entire community descend on your house as soon as the death is sort of broadcast, or word of mouth as it traditionally is there, and people from who had any connection with the person who's died will just turn up on your doorstep with cakes and tea bags and sandwiches, and there's this big wake event where everybody sits around drinking tea and eating cake.
So that's before the
funeral. So that would happen at kind of the evening of the death, or very much the next day. So it's quite difficult. You're trying to process grief, but you can't, because you get thrown into this kind of routine that has to happen, and you just go into like an overdrive of, well, we've got to provide food, and we've got to make tea, we've got to talk to these people. But so there's good points and bad points to it, in that everybody comes and talks about the person who's died, and the traditional line is sorry for your troubles, and then you've got a very traditional funeral that will happen. Most funerals will be church funerals. There's only one crematorium in Northern Ireland, so it's traditional burials, and you are very quickly thrown into this this routine. But it's very openly talked about, and not so much nowadays because they've got more funeral homes and things. But when I was a child, until I left home at 18, any death that happened in the house, so I've had my great uncle die at home, my grandfather died at home, my granny died in hospital, but she was brought home, and the body is laid to rest in the house. And people come to see the body and say goodbye. So It's very, very different to what it's like here in England. And when I first moved here, I was like, nobody talks about death. why is everybody so scared to talk about? And I was almost, because I was trained to be a nurse, I was seen as being like a little bit odd, because I was quite happy to talk about death, and so much so that I ended up doing my dissertation when I was doing my degree in nursing on how student nurses perceive death and how they cope with it.
Right.
So so that was quite interesting. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you did that dissertation. That sounds really fascinating. You've worked obviously as a nurse and dealt with death professionally. The thing I'm always interested in is when somebody dies, what have you sensed in that moment? You talk about your great uncle and being around it, exposed to it as a child, but also as professionally.
Yeah.
What happens in that moment? What would you say takes place?
I kind of got the reputation of being the death nurse on my last ward, because quite often other nurses were quite nervous and anxious of it, and if they knew a patient was dying, quite regularly I would be given that patient to care for, because it was something that didn't frighten me, didn't faze me, and I wasn't overwhelmed by supporting the relatives, because I dealt with talking to people who had experienced grief since I was a small child, and for me it was always probably the most special moment about being a nurse, being able to, especially if the family weren't there, being the one to sit with the patient in those last few moments and make sure that they're as comfortable as possible, that they're as well cared for, like you're just talking to them and being gentle with them, and trying to make sure that they have the best death possible. And I think probably as a nurse, one of the things that one of the most special things to do was to be able to lay that body out and present it in as best a way you could for the family to come and say goodbye. And it is an incredibly special thing to be able to do, and it was something I took great pride in, and something I made huge efforts to make sure any student nurses were taught to do that in as dignified and as precious a way as possible. And just putting in all the extra nice little things to make it as nice as and as good as you could make it. But it is an incredibly special time.
Definitely. And I think for a lot of people during COVID, relatives haven't been able to be there.
So it's the anniversary tomorrow. So my mum-in-law died this time last year, and I would say we've not been able to grieve properly for her, because she had a massive stroke, was taken away in the ambulance, and we were told that we couldn't go to the hospital with her. We had to just say goodbye to her in the back of the ambulance. I wasn't actually there, Gare was there, because we weren't allowed too many people in the house whenever the paramedics were coming and things, when we knew what was happening with her. And she was then in Addenbrooke's for a week, unconscious, and we were very fortunate she was put in a green unit, so she was allowed one visitor a day for 1 hour a day, and we were so grateful that different members of the family were allowed to go and be with her. But I was the last person to properly be with her, and Ola was able to come as well, and I was able to go and sit with her and say my goodbyes. But it was really hard leaving her that day, knowing I knew she was going to die within the next few hours. She lasted another 6 or 7 hours, and thinking I can't be with her, or a member of the family can't be with her, and that was incredibly painful, thinking she's going to die on her own because we're not allowed to be there. We were blessed with some fabulous nurses who one who set up her nurse's station in my mother-in-law's room, because she was like, I will not have her left alone, because you know, it's the least we can do in this situation. So, and she was a bit naughty, she did sneak my daughter in to see her when she shouldn't have, and broke the rules and got in trouble. But she said, I don't care, this is too important, because had been in Switzerland and hadn't seen her granny for a very long time, and she needed to go and say goodbye. So yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if I answered the question.
No, that's great. So in terms of grief, you use the word grief there, obviously, and not feeling like you've not been able to process it. Can you say some more about that?
Well, I've probably processed it now, but the way I was brought up, you dealt with death in quite a matter-of-fact, routine kind of way, and because you were thrown into this expected routine, there wasn't a lot of time to process your loss and to express your grief, and I had a few very difficult bereavements when I was younger, before I left home, with my best friend at school's brother was killed by the IRA and the Troubles in a very highly publicised murder that happened, and I just, there were no grief support counsellors, anything like that at the time, so I did my best as a friend to support his sister, but I didn't really feel I had anybody to turn to talk about my level of grief. I then had another friend who was killed in really tragic. She was the same age as me. The Pope was coming to visit Ireland, and her father flew small aircraft, and they were flying from where we lived to south of Ireland to see one of these big cases when the sort of events where the Pope was appearing, and fog came down and their plane crashed. And I remember my mum waking me one morning before school and saying, Carl was dead. I'm like, what are you talking about? She just said, they've all been killed in the crash. And I'm like, I was just completely in shock. I was probably about 12, 13 at the time, and I started to cry, and my mum got quite cross with me and said, I don't know what you're crying about. You're not one of the family. And I was like, okay. So you're kind of taught that to hold your grief inside and not to express it particularly. And then I went to uni, and again a very highly publicised atrocity that happened in Northern Ireland. One of my best friends from school was killed in a bombing, and it was very difficult to process, and I ended up falling, basically in my second year at uni, completely falling apart, because I was away from my culture where everybody kind of rallied around each other, and yeah, you didn't really express your grief, but you knew there were lots of people there, and you could talk, and you talked about it, to being away from all that and having to try and process this very difficult thing that had happened, and not having really any outlet. And I had some really good friends at uni who held me together, but I used to just, particularly at church, I'd just cry and cry and cry and couldn't understand why I was crying all the time. And at the time I was quite very involved in the Christian Union at uni, and sometimes you get very enthusiastic young Christians who not as mature in their faith as they kind of need to be, and say things that they shouldn't. And one of the leaders at the time told me I really needed to stop grieving, that I was sort of tied up in a spirit of grief that I needed to be cut off from him. And at the time you kind of think, oh well, maybe, and I kind of felt I wasn't allowed to grieve anymore, so I sort of bundled it all up and hid it all away, and it sort of welled up inside me lots, but I didn't really feel I was allowed to, that it was right to express it or talk about it. And that kind of constantly accumulated as you had other bereavements and deaths and things, and I ended up sort of having I suppose a crisis when, after my children were born, and I had a bit of a near-death encounter myself having them, and I ended up then having to have quite a lot of counselling, and the release at being allowed to just let all this grief out was so huge, and so I think you never ever tell anybody what, this is my feeling, you should never tell anybody what grief should look like or how they should express their grief. Grief is such an individual thing that everybody expresses differently, and the best thing you can do to support somebody who's grieving is to just let them express it in the way that's best for them, and don't try to put words in their mouth, or don't try to even explain it away. Just the presence of being there and letting somebody just spill out how they're feeling and not judging them is probably, I would say, the thing that's it. Having somebody who let me do that is probably what's saved me and helped me sort of not end up with some kind of major crisis. But yeah, I think grief is what it is to the individual, and don't try and make it be anything else for anybody else, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. You just answered 3 questions in one.
Oh,
brilliant. No, that's so good, because I think there is that, you know, one of the questions that I've asked in other interviews is, you know, what does grief look like, and the thing that constantly comes up is it is just different for everybody. So do you think grief ever goes away? I think you find ways of managing it. I don't think it's like it leaves holes inside you, and I think some things fill those holes, but I don't think they're ever fully filled, and I don't think it's right that they're ever fully filled, because when somebody precious to you is taken away, and you know, creates that hole, I think it's right that the scar's left. That's a lovely way of putting it.
Yeah, and scars can be beautiful, and yeah, some people see them as ugly, but I sometimes think, you know, that they are beautiful marks that are kind of left on you. And I suppose the most, obviously we're still dealing with processing the death of Ger's mum this time last year, and his dad only a couple of years previous to that. And the way we've dealt with it as a family is we just talk about her every single day. It's just normal part of the conversation. So my girls just, there won't be a day goes past that we don't have a joke or a laugh or a cry or a memory of something that Granny did. And we've got bits and pieces of hers around the house that just have positive memories for us. I've got little teddy bears and things that she collected, and we've got her little dog still.
So you've got a dog as well.
And we've always said that while the dog's alive, she will never be dead. She's such a similar character. But yeah, I'd say other things do fill the holes, but there's always going to be that mark. Yeah.
And I think one thing that you've constantly come back to through all of it, even, you know, your experiences as a child, having other people around you and being able to talk about the person that's died, even if at times that felt like I just want some space to think. That aside, I think the thing that you've constantly said is being able to talk about it, and that's one thing it sounds like you've done with your family. And I think it's the one thing that doesn't come naturally in
Mm.
England, definitely in our culture
Yeah.
in this day and age. And yeah, it's the one thing we probably need to do
Yeah.
far more of, and especially when it comes to our children. And your children are young adults
Yeah.
now, so with the death of their granny and their what do they call him,
Granddad.
granddad,
Yeah.
2 years before they weren't little children.
No.
But as a family, it sounds like you've talked about death. You know, what kind of and you've supported as a nurse, you've supported families. How do you see children sort of featuring in the grief process with families? What advice or what have you witnessed? What's worked? What's a good thing?
I think it's wrong to hide children away from it or try to protect them from it, because it's such a normal part of life, and to try and shield them will have worse effect, I think, in the long term. Obviously, you've got to be very select in the words you use and how you talk to them about it. But I think, for a small child, if a grandparent dies, let them create a memory box and photographs, and just remember happy times and even sad times, and just have them constantly. It's not making it, we're going to sit down and talk about grandpa now. It's just having that constant natural conversation where it comes up, and not being scared to talk to smaller children about death, because it's a life event. And if you can't teach children from a small age that it's okay, to cry and be sad, and see, pets is a really good way of helping children to start to process the grief that's felt with loss. But don't shield them from it. Don't protect them and think, I was going to funerals at like the age of 6 or 7, because that's what was, and it wasn't easy. And I'm talking like burial funerals. But that's may not necessarily been right either. But because it was just such an open part of life, it was never something that you're particularly scared of or afraid of. And I think it's good to obviously have stories and things that you can read to children, where death happens, and you can talk about loss. Helping them to start thinking that it's an okay thing to do,
that they can give language to in their own way, or expression to in their own way. Because one of the things that the Christian story shows us is this kind of cycle of life, death, resurrection. So it's something we see in the Jesus story. But we also see it, you see it in nature as the seasons change, which suggests, and does only suggest, that out of death, new life comes. Would you say that is true?
Yeah, I think out of death, like Jesus almost resurrecting from his death, I do think that often I would say, out of most of my experiences of death, some new shoot of life has come. Either it's given me a new awareness of something, or it's given me, how do you verbalise it? Oh gosh, it's difficult. Sometimes that new life is something that's released within you, or it can be as tangible as seeing the characteristics of the person you've lost in a new baby in the family. Sometimes even something like that can, but I do think there is often new life comes from death, whether it's a new life experience, or it gives you a new courage sometimes to move on. But and I think maybe when you wallow in death and wallow in grief and aren't able to move on, and that's when you don't see the new life coming. Does that?
Yeah,
Does it
I
make
think you're right. And I
sense?
think when it's very raw and very real and very immediate, I don't think it's easy to see
Yeah.
that anything could grow out of it. And I think sometimes it is when you look back or
Yeah.
reflect, or even sometimes I don't think we do realise until we choose to stop and look for
Yeah.
it, and you actually say, oh, actually, yeah, that wouldn't have happened, and this has happened, and
Yeah.
I think we do see it, but sometimes that does take time.
It does, and it's not something you think about. You don't think, oh, I've experienced this new feeling because I had grief or whatever. But it's when you do look back and see that path that you've walked, and you see some of the positives that have happened to you. Maybe not as a result of, but how it's maybe the grief has changed you, and maybe new attributes it's given you or whatever. So yeah, I do think new things come out of it. Like some people completely change their job or their calling in life as a result of bereavement, and it does release new things for them in that way. But and I think it's a good thing to be open to.
Okay. So you know I was coming today to talk about death. Is there anything else that was sort of on your heart and your mind that you wanted to kind of talk about?
Gosh, no, I would, I suppose, think that not seeing. I think death is often associated with sort of grey blackness and just doom and gloom, but I think, especially if you're caring for people that are dying, is to just sometimes allow yourself to think about how you can make death a positive experience. So if I go back to my nursing days, just helping somebody to have the best death possible, as you would call it in healthcare circles, or as we were just talking about, letting something good come out of it, not to let the blackness overwhelm you and feel that you've got to stay in a place of grief, because sometimes there's an expectation on you that you've got to stay in this dark place, but sometimes to think, what would that person want you to do? Would they want you to stay in that deep dark place? And let grief be what let it be your thing. Don't try and grieve in an books tell you should grieve like this, and films you watch, there's all these films about people dying and stuff, and they behave like that. You might behave in the most bizarre way as a result of grief, but that's okay. Just let it be your way.